What if everything you learned about human origins was incomplete? Not wrong, exactly, just missing crucial pieces of a puzzle far more complex than anyone imagined. You probably know the story. It's been taught in classrooms for decades, repeated in documentaries, presented as settled science. Modern humans evolved in Africa around 300,000 years ago. Then, roughly 60,000 years ago, a small group of adventurous ancestors left the continent, spread across the globe, and replaced all other human species they encountered. Clean, simple. Africa is the cradle of humanity, and everywhere else is just where we moved later. It's a beautiful narrative, and for a long time, it seemed like the evidence supported it. Fossils, genetic studies, archaeological sites, they all pointed to Africa as the birthplace of our species. The out-of-Africa theory became more than just a hypothesis. It became the foundation of how we understand ourselves. But here's the thing about science. It doesn't care about beautiful narratives. It cares about evidence. And lately, the evidence has been telling a very different story. If you're using this to fall asleep, perfect. That's exactly why I make these. So maybe subscribe and tell me where you are and what time it is. I read through comments and it's wild. Tokyo at dawn, London at lunch, Los Angeles at midnight, all listening to the same story about where we came from. Over the past decade, something extraordinary has been happening in the field of human evolution. Fossils are turning up in unexpected places, dated to impossible times. Ancient DNA is revealing connections nobody predicted. Technologies we thought were uniquely African are appearing on different continents thousands of years too early. Each discovery adds another crack to the simple story we've been telling ourselves. There are 300,000-year-old Homo sapiens fossils in Morocco, far from East Africa, where we thought our species originated. There's evidence of humans in China 2.1 million years ago, over 1 million years before they were supposed to leave Africa. Stone tools in India that predate the out-of-Africa migration by hundreds of thousands of years. Neanderthal DNA in African populations that shouldn't have it, if all evolution happened on that continent alone. None of these discoveries disprove that Africa played a crucial role in human evolution, but they suggest something far more intriguing. What if human evolution wasn't a simple journey from one place to all the others? What if it was a complex dance of populations moving back and forth across continents, mixing, separating, evolving in parallel, then mixing again? What if modern humans didn't really evolve in just one place at all? This isn't a fringe theory pushed by outsiders trying to overturn established science. These questions are being asked by leading paleontologists, geneticists, and archaeologists at top institutions around the world. Scientists who spent their careers defending the out-of-Africa model are now publishing papers that challenge parts of it. The evidence has simply become too overwhelming to ignore. And here's what makes this moment so fascinating. We're living through a revolution in our understanding of human origins in real time. New technologies are letting us extract DNA from bones hundreds of thousands of years old. Dating methods are becoming incredibly precise. We're finding fossils in places nobody thought to look before, because we assumed there was nothing there to find. Every few months another study comes out that rewrites a piece of the story. It's like watching a picture slowly come into focus, except the image that's emerging isn't the one we expected to see. It's stranger, more complex, more mysterious, and ultimately more interesting than the simple narrative we grew up with. Tonight, we're going on a journey through time and across continents to explore this new understanding of human origins. We'll look at fossils that don't fit where and when they're supposed to exist. We'll dive into ancient DNA that tells tales of populations mixing in unexpected ways. We'll examine evidence of multiple human species evolving simultaneously in different parts of the world, then meeting, interbreeding, and creating something new. We'll explore why some scientists now think Africa wasn't so much the single cradle of humanity, but more like one room in a larger house where our origins played out across multiple continents over millions of years. This isn't about debunking the out of Africa theory entirely. It's about understanding that human evolution is messier, more complicated, and far more fascinating than we realized. It's about recognizing that the simple stories we tell rarely capture the full truth of what actually happened. So let's begin at the beginning, with the theory that shaped everything we thought we knew about where we came from. Because to understand where the story is going, we first need to understand where it started. For most of your life, if you paid any attention to human origins at all, you probably heard a story that seemed pretty straightforward, simple even, clean. Modern humans evolved in Africa somewhere between 200,000 and 300,000 years ago. They lived there for tens of thousands of years, developing the traits that made them unique: advanced intelligence, sophisticated language, the ability to create art and culture. Then, around 60,000 to 70,000 years ago, a small group of them left Africa, crossed into the Middle East, and from there spread across the entire planet. Within a few tens of thousands of years, these African emigrants had reached every continent except Antarctica. They replaced all the other human species they encountered: Neanderthals in Europe, other archaic humans in Asia, until finally, around 40,000 years ago, modern humans were the only human species left standing. This was the out of Africa theory, sometimes called the recent African origin model or the replacement hypothesis, and for decades it was the closest thing to settled science you could find in human evolutionary studies. Every textbook taught it. Every documentary presented it as fact. If you questioned it, you were either ignorant of the evidence or pushing some kind of agenda. The theory wasn't just accepted, it was celebrated. It unified the fossil record, the genetic data, and the archaeological evidence into one coherent narrative. Better yet, it carried a powerful social message. All modern humans shared a recent common ancestry in Africa. We were all Africans under the skin. Whatever superficial differences had developed between populations were just that: superficial, recent adaptations to local environments that meant nothing compared to our fundamental unity. It was beautiful. It was elegant. It solved everything. Or so we thought. Let me take you back to how this theory came together, because understanding what we thought we knew makes the cracks that appeared later all the more shocking. The fossil evidence seemed ironclad. In 1967, a team led by Richard Leakey discovered two partial skulls in the Homo Formation in Ethiopia. They were anatomically modern, or nearly so. High foreheads, rounded skulls, small brow ridges, all the features that distinguish us from our more archaic ancestors. Initial dating put them at around 130,000 years old. Later, refinements pushed that date back to approximately 195,000 years ago. These were at the time the oldest known modern human fossils anywhere in the world. Then in 1997, another crucial discovery. At Herto in Ethiopia's middle Awash region, researchers found three skulls that were slightly more robust than living humans, but still fundamentally modern in their anatomy. The dating was spectacular, 160,000 years old. The skulls showed evidence of intentional defleshing after death, suggesting complex burial rituals. These weren't just anatomically modern humans, these were culturally sophisticated humans, people who thought symbolically about death and meaning. As more fossils turned up across Africa, a pattern emerged. The oldest anatomically modern or near-modern humans were all in Africa. Nothing nearly as old showed up in Europe or Asia. Every fossil outside Africa was younger, sometimes much younger. The geographical distribution told a clear story. Modern humans originated in Africa and only later expanded elsewhere. But fossils can only tell you so much. They show you what ancient humans looked like, but they can't tell you about relationships between populations or trace migration patterns with any precision. For that, you need something else entirely. You need genetics. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, a revolution was brewing in molecular biology. Scientists had figured out how to extract and analyze DNA from living people and use that data to reconstruct evolutionary history. The key insight was this: the more genetic differences you see between two populations, the longer they've been separated. Mutations accumulate at a roughly constant rate, so DNA acts like a molecular clock, ticking off the generations since populations last shared common ancestors. The first big breakthrough came from studying mitochondrial DNA, genetic material that's only passed down through the maternal line. In 1987, a team led by Alan Wilson at Berkeley analysed mitochondrial DNA from 147 people, representing populations from around the world. Their conclusion was stunning and unambiguous. All modern humans shared a common female ancestor who lived in Africa roughly 200,000 years ago. The media called her mitochondrial Eve. The same pattern showed up when researchers looked at Y chromosome DNA, which traces paternal lineages. Y chromosome Adam, as he was inevitably called, also lived in Africa, probably between 200,000 and 300,000 years ago. The genetic evidence seemed to confirm exactly what the fossils were already suggesting. Modern humans originated in Africa, all of them. Every living person could trace their ancestry back to a relatively small population that lived in one region of one continent at one specific time in the past. Take a moment, if you would, and drop a comment about where you're watching this from and what time it is as you listen. Are you drifting off to sleep in California? Starting your morning in Berlin? Having lunch in Tokyo? It's remarkable how this story, this question of where we all came from, connects us across every time zone on the planet. But back to the science. The genetic data gave researchers something even more powerful: a timeline. By analysing the amount of genetic diversity in different populations, scientists could estimate when modern humans left Africa and how they spread across the globe. The pattern was remarkably consistent across multiple studies. Non-African populations showed less genetic diversity than African populations, much less. This made perfect sense if modern humans originated in Africa and only a small subset of that African population migrated out. That migration would carry only a fraction of Africa's total genetic variation, creating what geneticists call a founder effect. Every population outside Africa would descend from that small founding group, explaining why they were all genetically more similar to each other than any of them was to African populations. The dating was consistent too. Most genetic studies pointed to a major expansion out of Africa around 60,000 to 70,000 years ago. Some data suggested there might have been earlier attempts, small groups that left Africa before then, but if so, they either died out or left no genetic trace in living populations. The real expansion, the one that mattered, happened relatively recently in evolutionary terms. The archaeological records seem to support this timeline. Around 50,000 to 40,000 years ago, there's an explosion of cultural sophistication in the archaeological record. Cave paintings, carved figurines, complex tools, ornaments, musical instruments. This so-called Upper Paleolithic revolution appeared first or most dramatically outside Africa, suggesting that modern humans brought with them not just modern anatomy but modern behaviour. As they spread across Eurasia, they created art, developed new technologies, and fundamentally transformed the archaeological landscape. When modern humans encountered other human species, The out of Africa theory predicted they replaced them. Not necessarily through violence, though that probably happened sometimes. Mostly through competition. Modern humans were simply better at exploiting resources, more flexible in their behavior, more capable of innovation. In any given environment, modern humans would outcompete archaic humans for food and territory. Over time, the archaic populations would shrink and eventually disappear, leaving modern humans as the sole survivors. The Neanderthals were the test case. For most of the 20th century, scientists debated whether Neanderthals were a separate species or just a variant of our own. The out of Africa theory was clear: separate species, no interbreeding. When modern humans moved into Europe around 45,000 years ago, they encountered Neanderthals who'd been living there for hundreds of thousands of years. Within about 5,000 years, the Neanderthals were gone. Extinction by replacement. Modern human genes showed no trace of Neanderthal ancestry. We didn't mix with them. We replaced them. This was the scientific consensus by the early 2000s. The out of Africa theory had won. It explained the fossils, the genetics, the archaeology. It was supported by dozens of independent lines of evidence from multiple disciplines. The debate, most scientists believed, was over. Universities taught it as established fact. Museums built their human evolution exhibits around it. Science communicators presented it to the public as the definitive answer to one of humanity's biggest questions. Where do we come from? But science doesn't care about consensus. It cares about evidence, and new evidence was already emerging that would shake the out of Africa theory to its foundations. Small contradictions at first, fossils that didn't quite fit the timeline, genetic patterns that seemed odd if you looked at them closely, archaeological discoveries that raised uncomfortable questions. Most scientists dismissed these anomalies. Every theory has a few data points that don't fit perfectly. That's normal. You don't abandon a successful theory just because of minor inconsistencies. But these weren't minor inconsistencies. They were cracks, and those cracks were about to split wide open, revealing something far stranger and more complex than anyone had imagined. For decades, the story seemed settled. Modern humans evolved in East Africa around 200,000 years ago, stayed put for 140,000 years, then suddenly decided to leave around 60,000 years ago and colonize the rest of the world. It was clean, simple, easy to teach. The kind of narrative that fits perfectly into textbooks and museum displays. Then the fossils started talking back, not all at once, not in some dramatic moment where everything we knew was overturned. Science doesn't work that way. Instead, it was a slow accumulation of finds that didn't quite fit, dates that seemed wrong, locations that made no sense according to the established timeline. Little cracks in the foundation that kept getting wider, until suddenly everyone was asking, wait, what if we got this completely backwards? The first major crack appeared in Morocco, of all places, a site called Jebel Irhoud, about 60 miles west of Marrakesh. Now, Morocco isn't in East Africa, it's in North Africa, thousands of miles from the Rift Valley where modern humans were supposed to have originated. For years, archaeologists had been pulling fossils out of Jebel Irhoud, but they were thought to be Neanderthals or maybe some archaic human species, not really relevant to the story of where we came from. Then in 2017, a team led by Jean-Jacques Hublin dropped a bombshell. Using advanced dating techniques, they determined those Jebel Irhoud fossils weren't archaic humans. They were modern humans, or at least very close to it. And they weren't 200,000 years old. They were 315,000 years old, possibly older. Let that sink in for a second. Modern humans in North Africa more than 100,000 years before they were supposed to exist anywhere. That's not a minor discrepancy. That's the entire timeline being wrong by more than half. The skulls from Jebel Irhoud showed a fascinating mix of features. The faces were modern, distinctly Homo sapiens. You could put that facial structure on someone walking down the street today and nobody would look twice. But the back of the skull was elongated, more archaic, suggesting these weren't quite the same as modern humans who would come later. They were modernish, proto-sapiens if you want to get technical. But they were definitely our direct ancestors, not some evolutionary dead end or distant cousin. The scientific community's initial reaction was something between shock and denial. Research papers started appearing with titles like Revisiting the Origin of Modern Humans and Pan-African Evolution, a New Model. Conference presentations got heated. Because if modern humans were in North Africa 315,000 years ago, then the entire East African origin story needed serious revision. But Jebel Irhoud was just the beginning. The cracks kept spreading. In 2016, researchers announced another fossil that didn't fit. This one came from Mislia Cave in Israel, on the slopes of Mount Carmel overlooking the Mediterranean. What they found was a partial jaw with several teeth still attached. Doesn't sound like much, right? Just another ancient jaw in a region full of ancient human sites. Except this jaw was definitively modern human. The tooth morphology, the jaw structure, everything screamed Homo sapiens, and it was dated to at least 180,000 years ago, possibly as old as 200,000 years. Now Israel isn't in Africa at all, it's in the Levant, technically part of Asia. And according to the standard timeline, modern humans weren't supposed to be outside Africa until 60,000 years ago. This fossil was pushing that date back by 120,000 years, more than doubling the timeline of human presence outside Africa. The implications were staggering. Either modern humans left Africa way earlier than anyone thought, multiple times, in waves we knew nothing about, or, and this was the really disturbing possibility, maybe they didn't originate exclusively in East Africa in the first place. Maybe the whole story was more complicated, more spread out, more interconnected than the simple origin and dispersal model suggested. Other sites started getting re-examined. Fossils that had been sitting in museum collections for decades, originally classified as archaic or unclear, were being analysed with new techniques. Dates were being revised, and the pattern that emerged was deeply unsettling to the established narrative. There was Homo kibish in Ethiopia, dated to 233,000 years ago. There was Herto in Ethiopia at 160,000 years. Florisbad in South Africa at 260,000 years. Suddenly the record wasn't showing a single point of origin, but multiple populations across Africa developing modern human features at roughly the same time. And it wasn't just Africa. Apodema Cave in Greece yielded a skull that might be 210,000 years old, though that date remains hotly contested. Sites in China were producing fossils with surprisingly modern features at dates that seemed impossibly early. The Middle East was full of evidence for multiple waves of human migration in and out of Africa long before the supposed 60,000-year-ago exodus. The scientific debates got intense, not hostile necessarily, but passionate, because this wasn't just about dates and fossils. This was about the fundamental story we tell about where we came from. Every major paleoanthropology conference from 2017 onward featured heated discussions about these anomalous finds. Some researchers argued the dates must be wrong. Dating ancient fossils is tricky, full of potential errors. Maybe contamination threw off the results. Maybe the geological context was misunderstood. They pushed back hard, defending the traditional timeline. Others argued the fossils weren't actually modern humans. Yes, they had some modern features, but maybe they were just archaic humans who happened to look a bit like us. Convergent evolution, parallel development of similar traits in unrelated populations. It happens. But as more finds accumulated, these explanations became harder and harder to maintain. The dates were being confirmed by multiple independent methods. The fossil features were consistently modern, not just superficially similar. And the geographic spread was too wide to dismiss as coincidence or error. Something fundamental had to change in how we understood human origins. The breakthrough in thinking came when researchers stopped looking for a single origin point and started thinking about networks. What if modern humans didn't evolve in one place and then spread out? What if they evolved across a vast network of populations spread throughout Africa and potentially beyond? What if gene flow between these populations was constant, creating a kind of Pan-African evolutionary process? This wasn't really a new idea. Some researchers had been suggesting versions of it for years, but the new fossil evidence made it unavoidable. The Jebel Irhoud population in North Africa, the populations in East Africa, the groups in South Africa, they weren't isolated from each other. They were part of a larger network, exchanging genes and culture, evolving together even while separated by hundreds or thousands of miles. Think of it like this. You've got groups scattered across an entire continent, adapted to different local environments. Coastal populations, highland populations, savanna populations, forest populations, they're all dealing with different challenges, different selection pressures. But they're not completely isolated. Every few generations, individuals migrate, groups come into contact, genes get exchanged. No single population has all the modern human features. Some groups develop larger brains first. Others develop more graceful faces. Still others develop the genetic variants for symbolic thinking. But through constant gene flow, these features spread through the network, mixing and combining until you get the full modern human package. This explains the Jebel Irhoud fossils. They're part of the network, showing some modern features but not all of them, because the evolutionary process is still ongoing. It explains the Mislier cave jaw. These weren't some doomed early exodus. They were part of the normal pattern of movement and gene flow that had always characterized human populations. It also explained something that had puzzled researchers for years. Why did modern human features seem to appear in the fossil record gradually, piecemeal, rather than all at once? Because they were evolving gradually across a network of populations spread over an enormous geographic area. The textbook story of a single African Garden of Eden, where modern humans suddenly appeared fully formed, that was looking less and less tenable. The real story was messier, more distributed, more dynamic, but also, in its own way, more beautiful. Because what these fossils were revealing wasn't just a different timeline. They were revealing a different kind of origin story entirely. Not a story of one special population in one special place, but a story of networks, connections, gene flow across vast distances and deep time. The question was no longer, where did modern humans originate? The question was becoming, how did a network of populations spread across an entire continent and beyond manage to evolve together into a single species? And that question opened up possibilities that would have seemed radical just a few years earlier. If humans were evolving across such a vast network, with gene flow extending even beyond Africa, then maybe the whole concept of a single origin point was wrong. Maybe we needed to think bigger, more complicated, more interconnected. The fossils that didn't fit the narrative weren't anomalies. They were clues. Evidence that the story we'd been telling ourselves was too simple, too neat, too focused on single origins when reality was operating on a completely different scale. What came next would challenge everything even further. But what if the entire story was wrong from the beginning? What if modern humans didn't evolve exclusively in Africa and then spread out to replace everyone else? What if instead we evolved everywhere simultaneously across multiple continents, connected by just enough gene flow to keep us one species? This is the multi-regional hypothesis, and for decades it was the theory that nearly tore paleoanthropology apart. Picture the academic battlefield of the 1980s and 90s. On one side, the out-of-Africa proponents with their genetic data and their African Eve. On the other, a smaller but fiercely determined group of scientists who looked at the same evidence and saw something completely different. Not a replacement event, but a million-year-long process of evolution happening simultaneously across 3 continents. The champion of this alternative view was a paleoanthropologist named Milford Wolpoff from the University of Michigan. Brilliant, combative, and absolutely convinced that the out-of-Africa theory was missing something crucial. Wolpoff had spent years studying fossil skulls from every corner of the Old World: Europe, Asia, Africa, Indonesia. And the more he looked, the more patterns he saw. Patterns that didn't fit the neat narrative of African replacement. Here's what caught his attention. When you examine fossil skulls from China dating back hundreds of thousands of years, you see certain distinctive features: shovel-shaped incisors, particular cheekbone structures, specific cranial proportions. These same features show up in modern Chinese populations today. Similarly, fossil skulls from Indonesia show characteristics that persist in modern Aboriginal Australian populations. European fossils display traits still found in modern Europeans. This is what Wolpoff called regional continuity. The idea that modern populations in different parts of the world show physical connections to ancient populations from those same regions. Not just random connections, but specific anatomical features that seem to have been maintained across hundreds of thousands of years. If the out-of-Africa theory was right, if modern humans evolved exclusively in Africa and then swept out to completely replace all other human populations around 60,000 years ago, you wouldn't expect to see this kind of regional continuity. The replacement should have been total. African features should dominate everywhere. But that's not what the fossil record showed, at least not to Wolpoff and his colleagues. So they proposed an alternative. What if Homo erectus, that ancient human species that left Africa nearly 2 million years ago, didn't just settle different parts of the world and then get replaced? What if those populations kept evolving, kept changing, but stayed connected enough through gene flow that they all evolved together into modern humans? Think of it like a network of rivers, individual streams flowing in different directions through different landscapes, but all connected by tributaries and backflows. Genes moving between populations, not in massive migration waves, but in slow, steady trickles. Enough mixing to prevent the populations from becoming separate species, but enough isolation for regional differences to develop and persist. Under this model, modern human characteristics, the big brains, the graceful skeletons, the capacity for symbolic thought, didn't evolve once in Africa and then spread through replacement. They evolved everywhere at roughly the same time, spreading through populations as advantageous genes move from group to group through occasional interbreeding. The archaeological records seem to support this too. Tool technologies don't show sudden replacements in most regions. Instead, you see gradual evolution of increasingly sophisticated tools developing independently in multiple locations. Similar innovations appearing in Africa, Asia, and Europe at roughly the same times, suggesting parallel cultural evolution rather than one population inventing everything and then spreading it to others. And there was another piece of evidence that troubled the out-of-Africa camp: the genetic bottleneck. Remember those 1,280 individuals we talked about? If all modern humans descended from a small African population that expanded recently, our genetic diversity should be extremely limited, which it is. but multi-regionalists argued the bottleneck might have affected all human populations worldwide, not just Africans. Maybe the climate crisis that nearly wiped out humans in Africa also devastated populations in Asia and Europe, creating a synchronized bottleneck across multiple continents. This would explain why we have so little genetic diversity while still maintaining regional continuity in physical features. All human populations got hammered to near extinction simultaneously, but when they recovered, they still carried some local adaptations that had developed over hundreds of thousands of years of regional evolution. For a while in the 1980s, the debate was genuinely contentious. Major journals published papers arguing both sides. Academic conferences featured heated exchanges between out-of-Africa proponents and multi-regionalists. Careers were built and sometimes damaged over which theory you supported. But then the evidence started piling up against multi-regionalism. First came more sophisticated genetic analysis. When researchers looked deeper into mitochondrial DNA, then Y chromosome DNA, then eventually whole genome sequences, the pattern was undeniable. All modern human genetic lineages traced back to Africa, and they traced back relatively recently. Not millions of years as multi-regionalism required, but tens of thousands. The genetic diversity data was devastating to pure multi-regionalism. African populations showed far more genetic variation than populations anywhere else. This is exactly what you'd expect if humans had been in Africa longer than anywhere else, giving more time for mutations to accumulate. If humans had been evolving simultaneously across multiple continents for 1 million years, genetic diversity should be roughly equal everywhere, but it wasn't. Then came the fossil evidence that really hurt the multi-regional case. Researchers found the earliest anatomically modern human fossils in Africa, dating back nearly 300,000 years. Sites like Jebel Irhoud in Morocco showed modern human features appearing in Africa long before they showed up anywhere else. Meanwhile, the oldest modern human fossils in Asia and Europe dated to less than 100,000 years ago. The timeline supported out of Africa, not multi-regional evolution. Most damaging was what researchers found when they started comparing Neanderthal and modern human DNA. If multi-regionalism was right, Neanderthals should just be European variants of the same species that was evolving into modern humans everywhere. Their genes should blend seamlessly with ours, but that's not what happened. Neanderthal DNA shows they were a distinct lineage that split from modern humans hundreds of thousands of years ago. Not just regional variants, but different enough that they'd been evolving separately for ages. By the early 2000s, multi-regionalism had been largely dismissed by mainstream paleoanthropology. The genetic evidence was too strong, the fossil evidence too clear. Modern humans evolved in Africa and spread from there, replacing other human species they encountered. Case closed, except, as it turns out, not quite closed. Because here's where the story gets interesting again. As genetic technology improved and researchers could extract and analyze DNA from ancient fossils, they started finding something unexpected. Yes, modern humans evolved in Africa. Yes, we spread out and largely replaced other human populations. But the replacement wasn't complete. We interbred. When modern humans met Neanderthals in Europe, they didn't just fight them or outcompete them, they had children with them. Same with Denisovans in Asia. Possibly with other archaic human populations we haven't even identified yet. Today, if you're of European or Asian descent, roughly 2% of your DNA comes from Neanderthals. If you're from Oceania, you might carry 4–6% Denisovan DNA. Some African populations show genetic evidence of interbreeding with unknown archaic human species that never left the continent. This is where elements of multi-regionalism are sneaking back into the conversation, not the pure version that Wolpoff defended, where humans evolve simultaneously everywhere, but a hybrid model that acknowledges the out-of-Africa framework while incorporating multi-regional gene flow. Modern humans did evolve primarily in Africa. We did spread out and become the dominant human species. But when we encountered other human populations, we absorbed some of their genes. Those regional populations had been adapting to local environments for hundreds of thousands of years. They'd developed cold weather adaptations in Europe, high altitude adaptations in Asia, unknown adaptations in Africa. When we interbred with them, we picked up some of those locally evolved traits. This might explain Wolpoff's regional continuity observations, not because populations evolved in place, but because incoming modern humans absorbed genetic material from the populations they were replacing. A few % of archaic DNA could carry distinctive regional physical features, making modern populations look like they had some continuity with ancient local populations. It's not classical multi-regionalism, but it's not pure replacement either. It's something more complex, more nuanced. A story where the main narrative arc is out of Africa, but with important subplots involving ancient interbreeding and genetic exchange. Some researchers now call this the assimilation model. Modern humans evolved in Africa, but they assimilated genetic material from archaic populations they encountered during their expansion. We replaced other human species demographically, our numbers overwhelming theirs, but we didn't replace them genetically, not completely. The debate that once seemed settled is opening up again, not because multi-regionalism was right, but because the truth turned out to be more complicated than either side imagined. Evolution doesn't follow simple narratives. It's messy, opportunistic, full of unexpected connections and surprising outcomes. And as we're about to see, the real story of human evolution is messier than anyone expected, because it wasn't just happening between different species, it was happening within Africa itself, among multiple populations that we're only now beginning to understand. For most of human history, if you wanted to understand where we came from, you had exactly two tools: fossils and stone tools. That was it. You dig up ancient bones, measure skulls, compare jaw lines, and try to reconstruct our family tree from fragments of skeletons that were often incomplete, poorly preserved, or frustratingly ambiguous. Then in the 1980s and 90s, everything changed. Scientists figured out how to extract DNA from ancient specimens. Not living tissue, but bones that had been buried for thousands, sometimes hundreds of thousands of years. DNA that had been sitting in caves and frozen ground, waiting to tell stories that fossils never could. At first, nobody thought it would work. DNA degrades. It breaks down over time, shredded by bacteria, destroyed by water and heat, torn apart by chemical processes. After a few thousand years, you'd expect nothing to be left except molecular fragments too small to be useful. But then scientists discovered something remarkable. In certain conditions, cold, dry, stable environments, DNA could survive far longer than anyone had imagined. Not intact, not perfect, but recoverable. Tiny fragments that could be pieced together like a molecular jigsaw puzzle, revealing secrets that had been locked inside ancient bones for millennia. The first breakthrough came from mitochondrial DNA. These are tiny circular pieces of genetic material that sit outside the cell nucleus. They're inherited only from mothers, passed down through an unbroken maternal line stretching back to the origin of our species. Because there are thousands of copies in every cell, mitochondrial DNA is much more likely to survive than regular nuclear DNA. Scientists extracted mitochondrial DNA from dozens of ancient human specimens. They compared sequences, built family trees, calculated mutation rates, and they made a discovery that seemed to support the out-of-Africa theory perfectly. All modern human mitochondrial DNA traced back to Africa, specifically to a woman who lived somewhere between 150,000 and 200,000 years ago. The media called her Mitochondrial Eve. This looked like confirmation. All humans descended from a small African population. We'd all originated in one place, then spread out to conquer the world. Case closed, right? Not even remotely. Because in 2010, a team of scientists working in a cave in Siberia extracted DNA from a tiny finger bone. Just a fragment, a piece of pinky finger from what appeared to be a young girl who died in that cave about 50,000 years ago. They sequenced the DNA, expecting to find either a modern human or a Neanderthal. What they found was something nobody had predicted. This girl wasn't human. She wasn't Neanderthal either. She was something else entirely, a completely unknown species of human that had never been identified from fossils, a ghost species that we only discovered by reading the genetic messages hidden in a finger bone the size of a pebble. They called them Denisovans, named after the cave where that first bone was found. And then things got really weird. When scientists compared Denisovan DNA to modern human populations, they found something shocking. People living in Asia and Oceania carried Denisovan genes, not metaphorically, literally. Between 3 and 6% of the DNA in modern Melanesians, Aboriginal Australians and some Southeast Asian populations came directly from Denisovans. These ancient humans had interbred with modern humans, and their genes had been passed down through thousands of generations. But we'd never found a complete Denisovan skeleton. We barely had any fossils at all. Everything we knew about an entire human species came from DNA analysis. We could describe their genetic makeup in incredible detail, identify unique mutations, trace their evolutionary relationships, all from fragments of bones that would have told us almost nothing using traditional fossil analysis. And if Denisovans were hiding in our genes, what else might be? That's when scientists went back to look at Neanderthal DNA. Neanderthals had been discovered in the 1800s. We'd found hundreds of skeletons across Europe and Western Asia. We knew what they looked like, how they lived, what tools they made. But we'd always assumed they were a separate species that went extinct without contributing to modern human ancestry. In 2010, the same year the Denisovans were discovered, scientists completed the first full Neanderthal genome sequence. They extracted DNA from several Neanderthal fossils, painstakingly reconstructed the genetic code, and compared it to modern humans. The results were staggering. Everyone outside Africa carried Neanderthal DNA. Europeans, Asians, Native Americans, everyone whose ancestors had left Africa carried between 1 and 4% Neanderthal genes. The only people who didn't were populations that had remained in sub-Saharan Africa for the last 60,000 years. This meant that when modern humans left Africa and encountered Neanderthals in the Middle East and Europe, they didn't just compete with them. They interbred. They had children together, children who survived, reproduced, and passed Neanderthal genes down to us. Think about what this means. Every non-African person alive today carries genes from a species we thought went extinct without trace. Your ability to process certain foods, resist specific diseases, even aspects of your immune system. These might be Neanderthal gifts, genetic adaptations developed by a different species, now integrated into our genome and helping us survive in environments our pure African ancestors would have struggled with. But the revelations didn't stop there. As DNA analysis techniques improved, scientists started finding traces of other populations, ghost lineages that appeared in our genes, but couldn't be matched to any known fossil species. In 2019, researchers analysing African genomes discovered something extraordinary. Modern West African populations carried DNA from an unknown archaic human species, not Neanderthal, not Denisovan, something else entirely. Something that had interbred with modern human ancestors in Africa between 50,000 and 100,000 years ago. Nobody has found fossils of this ghost population. We don't know what they looked like, where exactly they lived, or when they went extinct. We only know they existed because their genetic signature is still present in living people, a molecular ghost haunting our DNA. More ghost populations started appearing in the data. Some modern Asian populations carry traces of DNA that doesn't match any known human species. Aboriginal Australians have genetic markers suggesting their ancestors interbred with at least 2 different archaic populations during their migration through Southeast Asia. Denisovan DNA itself shows evidence of interbreeding with yet another unknown human species, creating a matryoshka doll of hybridization that goes back hundreds of thousands of years. The simple story of human origins was falling apart. We weren't a pure species that evolved in Africa and replaced everyone else. We were a mongrel, a hybrid, carrying genes from multiple archaic populations that we'd absorbed as we spread across the world. But here's what's really mind-blowing. These interbreeding events weren't accidents. They happened repeatedly across vast stretches of time and space. Modern humans encountered Neanderthals and interbred. We encountered Denisovans and interbred. We encountered unknown populations in Africa, Asia and Oceania, and every single time we interbred. This suggests something profound about human behavior. We weren't genocidal conquerors wiping out everything in our path. We were integrators, absorbers, species that incorporated useful genes from whatever populations we encountered. When we met other humans, even humans who'd been separated from us for hundreds of thousands of years, we still recognized them as potential mates, still had children with them, still created hybrid populations that combined the best survival traits from multiple lineages. The genetic evidence also revealed something else. These interbreeding events gave modern humans massive survival advantages. Neanderthal genes helped us adapt to cold climates when we moved into Europe. Denisovan genes helped us survive at high altitudes in Tibet and resist certain diseases in tropical Asia. Ghost population genes in Africa might have provided resistance to local parasites and diseases. In other words, interbreeding wasn't just something that happened. It was a survival strategy. By absorbing genes from populations that had adapted to local conditions for hundreds of thousands of years, modern humans could colonize new environments much faster than pure evolutionary adaptation would allow. This completely reframes the question of human origins. It's no longer about whether we evolved in Africa or somewhere else. It's about understanding how multiple human populations, separated by hundreds of thousands of years of independent evolution, came back together to create something new, something that carried the genetic wisdom of multiple lineages, adapted to multiple environments, refined by multiple evolutionary pressures. We are, all of us, the products of ancient hybridization, walking genetic museums carrying fragments of extinct species. Every person alive today is part modern human, part Neanderthal, part Denisovan, part mysterious ghost population that science hasn't even named yet. But if modern humans were interbreeding with all these different populations, where did those populations come from? How did humans end up scattered across 3 continents, evolving into different species, only to come back together through interbreeding? That question leads us back to Africa, but not the simple, single origin Africa of the traditional out of Africa theory. Something far more complex, far more fascinating and far more mysterious was happening on the African continent itself. Here's where the story gets even stranger. We've been talking about Africa as if it's one place, as if our ancestors lived in Africa the way you might live in a town or a city. But Africa isn't a single environment. It's not one ecosystem, one climate, one landscape. Africa is massive, 11.7 million square miles, 3 times the size of Europe. And 900,000 years ago, it was divided into dozens of distinct environments, many of them completely isolated from each other. This matters, because when scientists talk about humans evolving in Africa, they're often still thinking about a single population, one group of early humans gradually evolving the traits that would make us modern. But the genetic evidence tells a very different story. It suggests that Africa itself was home to multiple distinct human populations, separated by geography and climate, evolving semi-independently for hundreds of thousands of years, occasionally mixing when climate changes opened up migration routes, but often going their own evolutionary ways for millennia at a time. This is what anthropologists now call the African multi-regionalism hypothesis, and it's turning everything we thought we knew about human origins completely upside down. Think about what Africa looked like during those crucial periods of human evolution. You've got the Congo Basin, covered in dense tropical rainforest so thick that you could walk for days without seeing the sky. Then there's the Sahel, a band of dry grasslands stretching across the continent just south of the Sahara. Further south, the Kalahari Desert, nearly as inhospitable as the Sahara itself. In East Africa, you've got the Rift Valley, a geological fracture zone creating a mosaic of lakes, mountains and grasslands. Along the coast, completely different environments again, with access to marine resources that inland populations never saw. Each of these regions was like its own world, and during periods of climate stress, which happened frequently over the past million years, these regions became even more isolated. When the Sahara expanded during dry periods, it cut off populations in North Africa from those in sub-Saharan regions. When rainforests expanded during wet periods, they created impenetrable barriers between East and West Africa. Mountain ranges, deserts, dense forests, they all created boundaries that human populations couldn't easily cross. So what happened? Different groups adapted to their specific environments. Populations in rainforest regions developed strategies for hunting in dense vegetation, for processing toxic plants to make them edible, for dealing with the diseases that thrive in hot, wet environments. Groups in arid regions learn to track water sources across vast distances, to survive on minimal resources, to read landscapes in ways that would seem like magic to rainforest dwellers. Coastal populations developed the skills to exploit marine resources, something that requires completely different knowledge than hunting land animals. And here's the crucial part. They weren't just adapting culturally, they were adapting genetically. Natural selection was working differently in each region, favouring different traits, creating different variations. Over hundreds of thousands of years, this created what geneticists call deep population structure within Africa. Distinct lineages, all human, all capable of interbreeding, but each carrying unique genetic adaptations to their specific environments. The evidence for this is written in our DNA. When geneticists sequence genomes from different African populations today, they find patterns that can only be explained by long periods of isolation, followed by periods of mixing. It's not a simple family tree with one branch leading to modern humans. It's a braided stream, multiple lineages flowing separately for long periods, then coming together, exchanging genes, then separating again. Studies of mitochondrial DNA, which passes only through mothers, show divergence times between some African populations that stretch back hundreds of thousands of years. Y chromosome studies, tracking paternal lineages, show the same pattern. These populations weren't just separated by distance, they were separated by time, evolving independently while the climate kept them apart. But then something remarkable would happen. Climate cycles would shift, rainfall patterns would change, and suddenly regions that had been deserts would bloom with grasslands. Forests would retreat, opening up migration corridors. Rivers would swell, creating new routes between previously isolated regions, and human populations would move. They'd expand out of their refuges, encountering other populations that they might not have seen for thousands of generations. And when they met, they didn't fight, or if they did, they didn't only fight, they also interbred. This mixing, this periodic gene flow between long isolated populations, created something unprecedented in evolutionary history. It meant that beneficial adaptations that evolved in one population could spread to others. A group that had developed better tools didn't have to completely replace neighbors who had developed better social organization. They could exchange genes, combine innovations, create populations that carried the best adaptations from multiple lineages. Think of it as evolution in parallel. Instead of one population slowly accumulating all the traits that make us human, multiple populations were experimenting with different solutions to the problem of survival. Some experiments worked better than others. Some populations developed larger brains. Others developed better throwing accuracy. Some became better long-distance runners. Others developed more efficient sweat glands for cooling. And periodically, when climate allowed contact, these traits could mix and match across population boundaries. Archaeological evidence supports this model. Stone tool technologies show regional variation across Africa during crucial periods of human evolution. The tools found in South African sites from 300,000 years ago look different from those in East Africa from the same period. Different populations were innovating independently, developing distinct technological traditions. But then you see sudden appearances of new tool types, spreading across vast distances in relatively short time periods. That's the signature of population contact, ideas and genes flowing together across previously isolated groups. The famous archaeological sites that have given us our earliest modern human fossils, places like Jebel Irhoud in Morocco, Homo Kibish in Ethiopia, Florisbad in South Africa, they're spread across the entire continent. These weren't outposts of a single expanding population. These were separate groups, each with slightly different anatomy, each representing a different strand in the braided stream of human evolution. The skulls from these sites don't even look identical. Jebel Irhoud shows a mix of archaic and modern features. The face is modern, but the brain case is elongated, more primitive. Homo Kibish shows different proportions, a more rounded skull, but other archaic features. Florisbad looks different from both. They're all human, all recognizably on the path to modern anatomy, but they're not identical. Because they weren't one population, they were many. Climate was the great conductor of this evolutionary orchestra. Every 20,000 to 40,000 years, Earth's orbit shifts slightly, changing the amount of solar radiation different parts of the planet receive. In Africa, this drives massive changes in rainfall patterns. During wet periods, the Sahara becomes green, covered in lakes and grasslands. Migration routes open up. Populations expand and meet. During dry periods, the desert expands. Forests retreat. Populations contract back into refuges and become isolated again. For the past 1,000,000 years, this cycle has repeated dozens of times, each cycle creating new opportunities for isolation and innovation, followed by contact and gene flow. Each cycle testing different combinations of genetic variations, winnowing out what didn't work, preserving what did. It's like running hundreds of evolutionary experiments simultaneously, then combining the successful results. This is why the search for a single cradle of humankind might be fundamentally misguided. There wasn't one birthplace of modern humans. There were many. Or more precisely, there was one birthplace, Africa, but it was a distributed birthplace, a continent-wide process rather than a single location. What we call modern humans didn't evolve in one valley, one region, one ecosystem. We evolved everywhere in Africa at once, different populations contributing different pieces of the puzzle. The traits that make us human, our large brains, our sophisticated language abilities, our capacity for symbolic thinking, our long-distance running adaptations, our efficient cooling systems, they probably didn't all evolve in the same population. They evolved separately in different groups, then came together through interbreeding. This is Pan-African evolution. Not a tree with one trunk, but a network with multiple interconnected branches. Not a single population getting gradually more modern, but multiple populations exchanging innovations and genes across hundreds of thousands of years. By the time recognizably modern humans appear in the fossil record around 300,000 years ago, they're already the product of this continental-scale mixing process. They're already carrying genetic contributions from multiple ancient African lineages, some separated from each other for longer than modern humans and Neanderthals were separated. The implications are staggering. It means that human evolution was far more complex, far more distributed than we ever imagined. It means that no single fossil, no single archaeological site can tell the complete story of human origins, because there is no complete story in one place. The story's written across an entire continent, in dozens of locations, in hundreds of populations, over hundreds of thousands of years. And it means that when those first modern humans finally left Africa 60,000 years ago, they weren't a pure, uniform population carrying one simple evolutionary history. They were already a mixture, already the product of countless mixing events between ancient African lineages. They were already complex, already diverse, already carrying within their genes the legacy of multiple populations, multiple evolutionary experiments, multiple solutions to the challenge of being human. Africa didn't give rise to humans. Africa was humans. The entire continent was our cradle. Every valley that provided refuge during droughts, every cave that sheltered our ancestors from predators, every coastline that offered marine resources, every grassland that tested our endurance. They were all part of the story, all part of the process that made us what we are. We didn't evolve in Africa, we evolved as Africa, a mosaic of populations separated and reunited by the rhythms of climate, slowly, collectively becoming human. For decades, we told ourselves a simple story. Modern humans evolved in Africa around 300,000 years ago, stayed there while they developed their impressive brains and sophisticated tools, then finally left in one big wave about 60,000 years ago. Clean, linear, easy to understand. There's just one problem. It's almost certainly wrong. The evidence has been piling up for years, and it tells a much stranger tale. Our ancestors didn't wait around for 240,000 years before deciding to explore the world. They were leaving Africa far earlier than we ever imagined. Multiple times, through multiple routes. Some succeeded, many failed. And some of these early adventurers left traces that are forcing us to completely rethink human migration. Let's start in a place you wouldn't expect. A cave on the southern coast of Greece called Apodema. In the 1970s, researchers found 2 partial skulls there, but the fossils sat in storage for decades because nobody could figure out exactly what they were looking at. The skulls were fragmentary, difficult to date, and frankly, nobody expected anything revolutionary from Greece. Then in 2019, researchers using advanced CT scanning and uranium series dating took another look. What they found sent shockwaves through the anthropological community. One of those skulls, designated Apodema 1, showed clear features of Homo sapiens, modern human characteristics in its rounded shape, in the specific curve of the occipital bone at the back of the skull, and it was 210,000 years old. Let that sink in. A modern human skull in Greece, 210,000 years ago. That's 150,000 years before the supposed main migration out of Africa. This wasn't some primitive ancestor or early hominin. This was someone who looked fundamentally like us, living in Europe at a time when we thought modern humans were still confined to Africa, still evolving the traits that would eventually let them conquer the world. Now the skeptics immediately jumped on this. One skull doesn't make a migration, they said. It could be an outlier, a weird individual, a measurement error. And they had a point. Science requires multiple lines of evidence. You can't rewrite human history based on a single fragmentary fossil, except it's not a single fossil anymore. In China, archaeologists have found stone tools and fossil evidence at sites like Deoxian Cave that suggest modern humans were present in southern China at least 80,000 to 120,000 years ago. These aren't crude implements that could be attributed to other human species. These are sophisticated tools with clear similarities to African Middle Stone Age technology. The kind of tools modern humans were making. The fossils tell the same story. Teeth from Deoxian Cave show distinctly modern human features. Smaller, more gracile, with specific cusp patterns that match African Homo sapiens, not the robust teeth of other human species that were living in Asia at the time. Even more intriguing sites in the Levant, that narrow land bridge connecting Africa and Asia, show evidence of modern human presence going back at least 177,000 years, maybe more. Fossils from Mislia Cave in Israel and School and Kafsa caves show anatomically modern humans living outside Africa way earlier than the traditional timeline allows. And then there's Southeast Asia. In Sumatra, archaeologists have found teeth from Lida Asia Cave that appear to be from modern humans and date to at least 73,000 years ago, possibly earlier. That's before the supposed main migration even started. These early explorers would have had to traverse thousands of miles across diverse environments, possibly even engage in maritime travel to reach those islands. So what's happening here? Are all these dates wrong? Are we misidentifying fossils? Or is something much more interesting going on? The emerging picture suggests something radical. Our ancestors weren't sitting in Africa, waiting to evolve enough intelligence and technology to venture into the world. They were restless, curious, constantly probing the boundaries of their territory, always wondering what lay beyond the next river, the next mountain range, the next horizon. Think about it from their perspective. You're living in East Africa 200,000 years ago. Your group follows the migration patterns of game animals. You track gazelles and zebras across the grasslands. Sometimes these animals move north, following seasonal rains toward the Red Sea coast and beyond. So you follow them. Why wouldn't you? There's no line in the sand marking the edge of Africa. No border guard saying, "Sorry, you can't leave the continent yet. Come back in another 140,000 years when your species is ready." Just continuous landscape, extending north into the Sinai, northeast toward Arabia, east along the coasts. Climate played a massive role in enabling these early migrations. We now know that between about 130,000 and 70,000 years ago, there were multiple periods when increased rainfall created what researchers call green corridors across regions that are desert today. The Sinai Peninsula, the Arabian Desert, the Negev, all these barriers that seem impassable now, would have been grasslands dotted with lakes and rivers. During these windows, animals moved freely between Africa and Asia, and humans followed. Small groups, maybe just a few dozen individuals, crossing during periods when the journey was feasible. They weren't thinking about colonizing new continents. They were just doing what humans do, following food, seeking resources, exploring new territories. But here's where the story gets poignant. Most of these early migrations failed. The archaeological and genetic evidence strongly suggests that these pioneer populations didn't survive long. Maybe they numbered too few to maintain genetic diversity. Maybe they got hit by disease outbreaks. Maybe climate windows closed behind them, cutting them off from Africa just as local conditions deteriorated. Maybe they encountered other human species already occupying the best territories and lost the competition for resources. Whatever the reasons, these early adventurers left fossils and tools, but they didn't leave descendants, or at least not many. The genetic evidence from modern populations shows that most of our ancestry traces back to migrations that happened much later, primarily that major exodus around 60,000 years ago. But most isn't all, and that's where things get really interesting. Some recent genetic studies have found what researchers call ghost populations in our DNA, traces of ancient groups that interbred with our ancestors but then disappeared. Some of these signals might come from those early migration attempts. Small populations of modern humans who left Africa 100,000 or 150,000 or even 200,000 years ago survived for thousands of years in isolated pockets, then eventually encountered the main wave of later migrants and interbred with them before going extinct. Their genes survived even though their populations didn't. It's like a message in a bottle, floating across thousands of generations to tell us, we were here, we tried, we didn't make it, but we didn't entirely fail either. What drove these early expeditions? Why leave at all? Population pressure was probably a factor. Even small increases in human numbers would force groups to spread into new territories. The groups on the edges of the population range would naturally expand outward, and some would find themselves crossing from Africa into Asia almost by accident. But there's also something deeply human about exploration itself. We're a curious species. We see a mountain and want to know what's on the other side. We reach an ocean shore and wonder what lies across the water. This drive to explore, to push boundaries, to seek new territories, it's written into our psychology. It probably provided survival advantages during those desperate years of the bottleneck, when finding new resource areas could mean the difference between life and death. So our ancestors explored. They sent out scouts, pioneers, risk-takers who ventured beyond known territories. Most of the time these ventures probably didn't go far. A group would move a few dozen miles into new territory, decide it wasn't worth the risk and return home. But occasionally conditions were right. The rains came, the game was abundant, the new territory was genuinely better than where they'd been, and they kept going. Following coastlines, river valleys, game trails, moving incrementally, generation by generation, until they'd travelled hundreds or thousands of miles from where they started, until they were no longer in Africa at all, though they probably didn't think of it that way. The evidence from Apidima Cave suggests these early migrants made it far into Europe. The Chinese fossils show they reached deep into Asia. The Sumatran teeth indicate some groups developed the maritime skills needed to reach island Southeast Asia. These were major accomplishments, representing thousands of miles of successful migration across diverse and challenging environments. But they were also, ultimately, evolutionary dead ends. These populations either died out completely or remained so small and isolated that their genetic contribution to later humans was minimal. The successful colonization of the world would come later, launched by populations that had better numbers, better technology, maybe better timing in terms of climate conditions. But those later migrants were walking paths that had been explored before, following routes that earlier humans had already tested, learning from failures we can only glimpse in fragmentary fossils and puzzling genetic signals. Every fossil from these early migrations raises new questions. How many waves were there? How often did humans leave Africa and fail to establish lasting populations? Did these early migrants ever meet Neanderthals or Denisovans? Did they interbreed? Did they fight? Did they simply avoid each other in a world that still had plenty of empty space? We're only beginning to find answers. But one thing is certain. The story of human migration is vastly more complex than we imagined. Our ancestors were bolder, more adventurous, and more widespread far earlier than we ever gave them credit for. They were explorers in the truest sense, venturing into unknown territories with nothing but stone tools and collective knowledge. Most failed, but they tried. and occasionally, improbably, some succeeded long enough to leave traces that we're only now learning to recognize. The world our species would eventually conquer had been scouted many times before. The successful colonization built on centuries of failed attempts, on knowledge gained and lost and rediscovered. But the failures mattered too. They were part of the process, part of what made us human. The first thing to understand is this. When modern humans finally walked out of Africa and met Neanderthals and Denisovans, they didn't meet monsters. They met cousins. Not identical, not just like us, but not completely alien either. They were close enough that when they looked into each other's eyes, they were seeing something deeply familiar. The shape of the face was different, the body more robust or more compact, but the way the eyes moved, the way the hands gestured, the way voices rose and fell in the dark, that would have felt human. And that matters, because what happened next wasn't just conflict, it was contact, it was conversation, it was interbreeding. When you hear modern humans have Neanderthal DNA, it's easy to imagine one or two strange encounters and then back to business as usual. But the genetics tells a different story. Interbreeding didn't happen once. It happened again and again, over tens of thousands of years, in different places, under different conditions. You can think of it like overlapping waves, small bands of Homo sapiens moving into the Middle East, meeting Neanderthals already adapted to those lands. Later waves pushing deeper into Europe and Central Asia, finding Neanderthals again. Another group swinging eastward into Asia, meeting Denisovans from Siberia to Southeast Asia. Each time a few individuals from one group had children with individuals from the other. Most of those lineages vanished over time, but some survived, and their genes are still quietly travelling in our bloodstreams tonight. This raises an uncomfortable question for a lot of people. If Neanderthals and Denisovans could interbreed with us and produce fertile offspring, were they really separate species at all? Biology textbooks often give a neat definition. A species is a group whose members can breed with each other but not with other groups. But in practice, nature is messier. Closely related species often hybridize. Wolves and coyotes, grizzly bears and polar bears, even some songbirds that look and act very different. Evolution doesn't care about our categories. It only cares about what works. Humans, Neanderthals, Denisovans, these weren't three totally isolated kinds, sealed off from each other behind invisible genetic walls. They were more like branches of the same tree that had grown apart, then bent back toward each other when the wind of climate and migration brought them into contact again. Geneticists have a simple, almost brutal way to test how separate we really were. They look at how much DNA we carry from those other groups. Non-African people today carry on average about 1 to 2% Neanderthal DNA. Some populations in Papua New Guinea and nearby regions carry an additional 3 to 5% Denisovan DNA. But that's just what survived after tens of thousands of years of mixing, drift, and selection. When researchers reconstruct the past, they find evidence that early out-of-Africa humans may have once carried much more Neanderthal and Denisovan ancestry than we do now. Over time, some of that foreign DNA was weeded out because it didn't work well in a modern human genetic background. But some of it stayed, not by accident, but because it helped. This is where the story becomes less about who mated with whom, and more about what exactly we inherited. Some of the most important Neanderthal genes we carry are linked to our immune systems. Variants in genes that control how our bodies recognize and respond to pathogens, viruses, bacteria, parasites, show clear signals of Neanderthal origin. Imagine leaving Africa, where your ancestors had been battling certain diseases for hundreds of thousands of years, and walking into Europe and Western Asia, where a completely different microbial ecosystem had evolved. local Neanderthals had already been fighting those infections for hundreds of millennia. Their immune systems had been trained by that environment. When our ancestors interbred with them, they weren't just having children, they were downloading a survival file, a pre-tested immunological toolkit for living in a new world. People who inherited those variants may have been more likely to survive local plagues, heal from infections, raise their children to adulthood. Over time, those foreign genes spread, quietly favoured by natural selection. Denisovan DNA seems to have done something similar, but in a different way. One of the most famous Denisovan-derived gene variants today is found in Tibetan populations, and it helps people live at high altitudes where oxygen is scarce. If you or I try to move to 4,000 meters above sea level and live there permanently, we'd struggle. Headaches, fatigue, risk of complications during pregnancy. But people in Tibet have a version of a gene called EPAS1 that changes how their bodies respond to low oxygen. That version matches the Denisovan sequence almost exactly. Somewhere in the distant past, a Denisovan group adapted to thin mountain air. Their descendants, or their relatives, interbred with the ancestors of modern Tibetans. The Denisovan version of that gene was so useful that it spread rapidly through the population. Today, millions of people carry it, never knowing that part of their ability to live and work in the sky-high cold is a gift from a vanished cousin species. Other Denisovan and Neanderthal variants may influence how we process fats, respond to sunlight, even how we sleep and wake. Some are linked to skin and hair traits, some to metabolic pathways, some, less fortunately, to risks for allergies, depression, or autoimmune diseases. Hybridization didn't just give us powers, it also gave us vulnerabilities, and the patterns aren't random. They map onto the geography of ancient contact like ghost footprints. People with deep ancestry in sub-Saharan Africa generally have little to no Neanderthal or Denisovan DNA, not because they never interbred, but because Neanderthals and Denisovans mostly lived outside Africa. When a lineage never left, it never met them. So many African populations today preserve a cleaner signal of what the post-bottleneck humans looked like before they walked into Eurasia and met their cousins. Move into Europe and Western Asia and the picture changes. Almost everyone with ancestry from those regions carries that 1 to 2% Neanderthal DNA. The exact segments vary from person to person, but if you added them all together across millions of people, you could rebuild a substantial fraction of the Neanderthal genome just from the scattered fragments carried by modern humans. Go east, into China, Mongolia, Japan, Southeast Asia, and the genetic tapestry grows more complex. There is still Neanderthal ancestry, but now other signals emerge. Multiple episodes of interbreeding, with different archaic humans at different times. In Papua New Guinea, Australia, and parts of the Philippines and Indonesia, Denisovan ancestry is strongest. It's as if those islands and coasts were once a frontier where modern humans and Denisovans met, mixed, and vanished, leaving only their DNA as a faint, enduring echo. The deeper geneticists look, the stranger it gets. Some stretches of ancient DNA in modern people don't match Neanderthals or Denisovans, or us. They look like they came from something else. Another archaic population we haven't named yet. A ghost lineage. In Africa, this ghost is especially prominent. The continent that nurtured our earliest ancestors also seems to have sheltered other hominins, parallel experiments in being human that survived well into the time of Homo sapiens. Genetic studies suggest that some West and Central African groups carry chunks of DNA that diverged from our lineage far earlier than Neanderthals did. This implies interbreeding with another archaic population inside Africa itself, a cousin we've never met, whose bones may still be buried somewhere, unrecognized or undiscovered. Outside Africa, Some mysterious segments of DNA hint at multiple Denisovan-like groups, not just one. Perhaps a Denisovan population adapted to the cold forests of Siberia was genetically distinct from a Denisovan group thriving on tropical islands in Southeast Asia. Our ancestors might have met both at different times, inheriting different gene variants from each. Taken together, this paints a picture that is very different from the tidy diagrams in old textbooks. Human evolution isn't a straight line from primitive ape man to modern human. It isn't even a simple branching tree. It's more like a braided river, channels splitting and rejoining, water from one branch slipping quietly into another. So what then does it really mean to be modern human? It can't just mean having a particular skull shape, or a certain brain volume, or living in a specific place at a specific time. Neanderthals had brains as large as ours, sometimes larger. Denisovans probably had complex cultures we've barely glimpsed. Other African hominins might have had their own forms of tool-making and symbol use. If they could talk, tell stories, make plans, mourn their dead, care for their children, are we certain they were less human than we are? From the perspective of genetics, modern humans are not pure. We are mosaics. Each of us is a patchwork of ancestries layered over ancestries, stretching back not just to a single African bottleneck, but to encounters along the way, with Neanderthals in cold valleys, with Denisovans on windswept plateaus, with unknown hominins under African skies. From the perspective of evolution, modernity isn't a clear boundary, it's a gradient. A slow build-up of traits, symbolic thought, complex language, cumulative culture that at some point crossed a threshold. And once that threshold was crossed, something new appeared. A creature capable of imagining futures, telling stories about the past and reshaping entire ecosystems. But that creature didn't appear in one place, in one moment, as a single, isolated breakthrough. It appeared within a network, a web of populations exchanging ideas and genes across continents, sometimes cooperating, sometimes competing, sometimes merging so deeply that their separate names would eventually fade. When we say we are modern humans, what we're really saying is that we're the surviving branch of a much larger family, a branch that carries traces of all the others within it. We're the result of bottlenecks and expansions, of isolation and reunion, of divergence and hybridization. We are the children of many experiments in being human, the last of our kind, but not the only kind that ever was, and our DNA remembers them all, quietly, patiently, waiting for us to learn how to read its story. In that story there is no room for purity, only connection. No single origin point that makes one group special and another less than. Only a long, tangled history of shared struggle and shared survival. The hybrid human is not a footnote in that history. The hybrid human is the rule. It's what we are. So where does all of this leave us? If you've been waiting for a simple answer, there isn't one. Not anymore. The days of neat diagrams in textbooks, with a single arrow marching out of Africa and spreading peacefully across the world, are over. Modern science paints a picture that is richer, stranger, and far more tangled than that. But it's not chaos. There is a mainstream view. It's just a mainstream view that has learned to live with complexity. You can think of it like this. For most of the 20th century, scientists argued as if they were choosing between two rival maps. One map said, humans evolved in Africa, then spread out and replaced everyone else. The other map said, humans evolved everywhere at once, with ancient populations in Europe, Asia and Africa all gradually turning into modern humans together. Today, the consensus is that both of those old maps were partly right, and mostly wrong. The model that best fits the evidence now is sometimes called the assimilation model, or, depending on who you ask, weak replacement, leaky replacement, or structured out of Africa. The names don't matter as much as the basic idea. Imagine a river again. Not a single straight line, not a dozen totally separate streams, but something in between. One big river system, with many branching channels, side streams, and backwaters. Water flowing out of a main source, but constantly mixing with smaller flows, picking up new sediments, leaving traces behind. According to the assimilation model, something like this happened with us. Yes, the deepest roots of what we call modern humans are in Africa. The highest genetic diversity is there. The oldest fossils that look clearly modern are there. The earliest signs of behaviours we associate with us, symbolic art, long-distance trade, complex tools, are there too. But when those African populations expanded out into Eurasia, they didn't just steamroll over the locals and erase them. They met them, they lived alongside them, and in many cases they mated with them. Instead of replacement, it was more like absorption. Modern humans did not simply replace Neanderthals and Denisovans, they assimilated them. You can see the proof of this in your own cells. If you're of European or Middle Eastern ancestry, a few % of your DNA likely comes from Neanderthals. If your ancestry traces to parts of Asia or Oceania, you probably carry small fragments of Denisovan DNA. Different populations, different mixtures, tiny echoes of ancient encounters written into your chromosomes. The assimilation model says that our species spread from Africa, but as we spread, we folded in genes from other human groups we met along the way. A core African origin, wrapped in many regional layers. That's why, when scientists talk today, they almost never say out of Africa versus multi-regional anymore. Instead, they talk about how much of our ancestry comes from those early African expansions, and how much might be older, rooted in local populations outside Africa that had been there long before. The answer so far? For most people alive today, the majority of our ancestry still traces back to Africa within the last 100,000, 300,000 years. But not all of it. There are older branches, hidden tributaries, ancient streams running quietly under the surface. And this is where the debates really begin. Because while the overall picture is becoming clearer, the details are still fuzzy. Scientists agree that Africa was the main cradle of modern humans. They agree there was extensive interbreeding with Neanderthals and Denisovans. They agree there were multiple waves of migration, not just one. But the exact timing, the exact paths, the exact contributions of each ancient group, those questions are still wide open. Did modern humans evolve in one particular region of Africa, then expand out and replace other African populations? Or did they emerge from a patchwork of semi-connected groups across the whole continent, each contributing a piece of the modern human puzzle? Some call this idea the African multi-regional model, the thought that, even within Africa, there wasn't one single birthplace, but a network of populations, forest people, savanna people, lakeshore fishers, mountain dwellers, sharing genes, tools and ideas over hundreds of thousands of years, until eventually a constellation of traits we call modern gel together. Did something similar happen outside Africa, when we find modern-looking skulls in Greece from 210,000 years ago, or tools in China that look suspiciously human long before the classic out-of-Africa date? What exactly are we seeing? Are these early, failed expansions of African humans independent experiments in modernity, or something in between, a mix of African influence and local evolutionary paths? The consensus answer for now is cautious. Most researchers think these early appearances represent brief, partial expansions, little waves that pushed out during warmer periods, reached new regions, maybe interbred with local groups, and then died back when climates changed, leaving just a trickle of their genes behind. But the jury is still out. Every year, new fossils and new dates arrive that force everyone to redraw their mental timelines. And then there are the ghosts. Ancient DNA has revealed at least 2 or 3 ghost populations. Humans that left no known fossils we can point to, but whose DNA lingers as faint signatures in our genomes. In Africa, there are hints of deeply divergent lineages that split off from the ancestors of modern humans more than 500,000 years ago, then later mix back in. What did they look like? Where did they live? Were they separate species, or just very distant cousins? No one knows. For now, they are shadows in the data, placeholders for future discoveries. In Asia, the story is even more tangled. There may have been multiple distinct Denisovan-like populations, some better adapted to high altitudes, some to tropical forests, some to island environments. We only have a handful of bones and teeth. A finger bone in a Siberian cave, a jaw fragment from the Tibetan plateau, a few fragments from caves in China that might be or might not be part of the same broader Denisovan family. It's like trying to reconstruct an entire civilization from a couple of lost coins and a broken statue. New finds keep complicating things further. In the Philippines, fossils of a small, primitive human species called Homo luzonensis. In Indonesia, the tiny hobbits of Flores, Homo floresiensis, surviving until around 50,000 years ago, overlapping in time with modern humans. In Israel, skull fragments from Nesher Ramla that don't fit neatly into any known category, but show a blend of modern and archaic traits. Each discovery is like a new character entering a story you thought you already understood. This is why, when you ask scientists today, where did modern humans evolve? Many of them will answer with a long pause. Then they'll say something like, mostly in Africa, but in a very structured way, with contributions from archaic populations both inside and outside the continent. Or they might say, more simply, it's complicated. And that complexity isn't going away. If anything, it's just getting started. Because the tools we use to reconstruct this story are changing fast. Ancient DNA techniques are becoming more sensitive, able to extract genetic material from older, more degraded bones, from warmer climates, from places once thought hopeless. Proteomics, reading ancient proteins when DNA is gone, is opening windows into times and regions where genetic material doesn't survive. Computers are getting better at simulating complex population histories. Instead of simple models with 1 or 2 migrations, we can now run scenarios with dozens of population splits and merges, bottlenecks and expansions, and compare them to the patterns we see in real genomes. It's like trying millions of possible histories and asking which ones leave fingerprints that match our DNA. We're also learning to read the environment itself. Sediments in caves can preserve microscopic traces of DNA from animals, plants, even humans who passed through long ago. We're beginning to find human DNA in places where there are no bones at all. Footprints in the sand without the feet. As these technologies mature, they will almost certainly complicate the story of our origins even further. They may reveal unknown migrations, unknown populations, unknown episodes of interbreeding. They may show us that some traits we thought evolved in one place actually arose in another. They may push back dates, redraw maps, upend tidy narratives. But this isn't a sign that science is failing. It's a sign that it's working. Science is not a book of final answers. It's a process, a long, careful negotiation between evidence and imagination. Every fossil, every genome, every new date is a vote in an ongoing election about what really happened. The majority can shift, old ideas can lose, new ones can win. And sometimes the best available answer today will look naive to people 100 years from now. The current scientific consensus is not that out of Africa was wrong, or that modern humans evolved everywhere at once. It's that the simple versions of both those stories were incomplete. Modern humans likely did arise primarily in Africa, but not in a single Garden of Eden. More like a network of gardens, some thriving, some failing, some hybridizing, all exchanging genes and ideas over immense stretches of time. As those African populations expanded outward, they met other humans, Neanderthals, Denisovans, and perhaps others we haven't even named yet. And those meetings left marks in our DNA that we still carry. We are, all of us, mosaics, layer upon layer of ancient encounters, Africa in our core, Eurasia in our edges, ghosts in our gaps. Lying here, listening in the dark, you are part of that living consensus. Your body is a document written in billions of letters, an ongoing draft that started long before there were nations, before there were races, before there were even sapiens and Neanderthals. Tomorrow, new data might tweak the story again. A jaw in a cave, a scrap of DNA in the soil, a better algorithm that sees patterns we've missed. When that happens, the consensus will shift. Textbooks will change. Old diagrams will be redrawn. The river of our origins will get a new bend, a new branch, a new hidden spring. But the deeper message will stay the same. We come from many places, but we are one species. Our past is tangled, but our fate is shared. And the story of where we come from is still being written. So, what do we do with all of this? You've just followed a chain of evidence that stretches almost 1,000,000 years into the past. Bottlenecks, vanished cousins, migrations across continents, genes crossing and recrossing between different human species. It's a lot to take in. It can feel abstract, distant, like a movie playing on fast-forward somewhere far away. But this isn't just a story about fossils and DNA. This is a story about you, about what it means to be human when the simple answers don't work anymore. When we came from here, or we came from there, breaks down into a web of crossings, returns, and forgotten faces in the dark. For a long time, origin stories have been about drawing lines, us and them, here and there, this group and that one. But the more we learn, the more those lines start to blur. The neat single source out of Africa story turns into a mosaic of populations across Africa. The tidy separation between modern humans and Neanderthals turns into a record of interbreeding, shared children, shared genes. Denisovans, once just a finger bone in a Siberian cave, suddenly show up in the DNA of people living on tropical islands thousands of miles away. If you zoom out far enough, something becomes very clear. There is no them, there's just us. One branching, twisting, repeatedly entangled family tree. One story told in different accents, in different climates, on different landscapes, always about the same small, fragile, ridiculously persistent creature trying to stay alive under impossible conditions. Think about the bottleneck again. 1,280 breeding individuals, give or take, hanging on at the edge of extinction. That's not many. You could fit them all into a modern movie theatre. One small crowd, scattered across thousands of miles, never all seeing each other at once, never realizing they were carrying the future of the species in their bodies. They didn't know they were the last hope for anything. They were just trying to keep their children alive. Now follow the thread forward. Every person who has ever lived, every language ever spoken, every story ever told around every fire, unravels from that tiny, shivering network of survivors. And not just modern humans. Neanderthals owe their existence to that same bottleneck. So do Denisovans. 3 different evolutionary experiments, 3 different ways of being human, all built on the same genetic foundation, all shaped by the same ancient crisis. So when we talk about our story, whose story is it? The answer is all of them. You carry Neanderthal genes if you have ancestry outside of Africa. You might carry Denisovan genes if you come from parts of Asia or the Pacific. You carry African bottleneck genes no matter where you're from. Your DNA is like a crowded hall of ancestors, some with faces we can recognize, some we only know from a few tiny fragments of bone, some who have left no fossils at all, only quiet fingerprints in our genomes. Human identity, in this light, stops being a puzzle of separate pieces. It becomes a tapestry. Every thread touches dozens of others. Every colour comes from somewhere else. People who think they're completely separate, completely different, turn out to share long stretches of DNA that go back to the same tiny, desperate group on some forgotten African landscape 900,000 years ago, and to the Neanderthal woman buried in a European cave 70,000 years ago, and to the Denisovan hunter crossing a cold Asian river in the dark. Origins stop being borders. They become bridges. This has a strange side effect. It makes racism, nationalism, and all the stories that try to turn human variation into rigid categories look very small, very recent, very fragile. Take any two people alive today, any continents, any backgrounds, any histories. Underneath the surface differences, both of them are carrying the same deep story. Your ancestors survived the bottleneck. Your ancestors met other human species and instead of wiping them out on sight, sometimes had children with them. Your ancestors moved across deserts, across ice sheets, along coasts, through forests. Sometimes they were pushed by drought or cold or conflict. Sometimes they were pulled by curiosity, by hunger, by the faint rumour that the grass might be greener just over the next ridge. The details are different, but the pattern is the same. Movement, mixture, adaptation. This is what our genetic heritage is telling us, over and over again. Humans don't just adapt biologically. We adapt culturally, socially, imaginatively. We invent new ways to live, then share those ways with each other. We borrow, we blend, we remix. We survive by refusing to stay the same. Those Denisovan genes that help Tibetans live at high altitude, that's adaptation. But so is the invention of clothing, of fire use in cold climates, of boats crossing open water, of trade routes that let people in one region rely on food and tools from hundreds of miles away. The real superpower of Homo sapiens isn't one specific gene. It's the way genes, minds, and cultures all work together. You're the product of bodies that change to handle thin air and bitter cold, of brains that change to handle language and symbolic thought, of cultures that change to handle bigger groups, more complex relationships, longer memories. Our diverse genetic heritage doesn't just tell us that we're mixed. It tells us that we are built for change. If our species had a motto, written underneath that fused chromosome from the bottleneck era, it might be something like, "Nothing stays the same, and that's how we survive." So what does that say about human nature? It says human nature isn't a single fixed thing. It's a range. Neanderthals burying their dead with flowers, or at least with care, show one end of that range. Tenderness, memory, symbolic thought, maybe even grief. Modern humans carving tiny figurines or painting animals deep in caves show another. Imagination, abstraction, the ability to represent things that aren't right in front of us. Denisovans crossing water to reach islands show still another. Risk-taking, exploration, the willingness to step into the unknown. All of that is human. Cooperation is human. Trade networks, shared tools, collective hunts, alliances between distant bands mediated by marriage and gift-giving. Conflict is human too. Competition for resources, territorial disputes, groups pushing others aside. But when you look at the long arc of the story, one pattern keeps repeating. Cooperation scales better. The groups that formed alliances, that learned from each other, that shared genes and tools and ideas across long distances, those are the groups whose descendants are still here. The genetic signature of structured mating between groups, those carefully maintained kinship networks, isn't just a curiosity. It's evidence that our ancestors realized, consciously or not, that connection was a survival strategy. The most successful humans weren't the most isolated. They were the most connected. And somewhere along the way, something else emerged on top of all this genetic and cultural exchange. Story. Once language became sophisticated enough, once our ancestors could talk not just about "there is water over that hill," but my grandmother told me that during the last dry time, people went north and found a valley with a river that never dried up. The past became a tool. Memory turned into guidance. Stories about the bottleneck, about the great drying and the great return of the rains, might have been told and retold for hundreds of thousands of years in different forms, maybe as myths about fire in the sky or angry spirits of the desert, maybe as clan histories about the time the people were reduced to just a handful and almost disappeared. We'll never know the exact words, but the impulse is familiar. We still do it. We still sit in the dark and tell each other where we came from, what we've survived, what it all might mean. The only difference is that now our campfire includes fossils, DNA sequencing, climate models, and archaeological digs. Science has become part of our storytelling, and instead of making the story colder or less meaningful, it does the opposite. It adds detail. It adds texture. It lets you look at your own hands and realize that the cells in those fingers carry instructions that were tested and refined through ice ages and droughts and volcanic winters. It lets you lie in bed at night and imagine that somewhere inside your genome there are little fragments from a Neanderthal ancestor who stood under a pale ice age sun, and from a Denisovan who watched strange stars over an Asian forest, and from a bottleneck survivor who walked across a cracked, drying savanna, not knowing if there would be water on the other side of the horizon. All of them are still here, in you. That's the beauty of our intertwined ancestral story. It refuses to be simple. It refuses to draw sharp, clean boundaries between peoples, between continents, between us and them. It keeps reminding us that we are, and always have been, a single, restless, braided lineage. So when you hear arguments about who really belongs where, about who is more original or more pure, you can quietly remember that no one alive today is pure anything. We're all mixtures of mixtures. We're all descents of survivors, inheritors of a shared crisis no one remembers, carriers of genes and ideas that have been crossing and recrossing the globe for hundreds of thousands of years. This doesn't erase our differences. It doesn't flatten culture into some bland global sameness. If anything, it makes our differences more interesting, more meaningful. Because now, when you see another language, another tradition, another way of telling the human story, you can recognize it for what it is. Another branch on the same ancient tree. Another way of carrying forward the same stubborn determination to live. As you drift towards sleep, you can hold this in your mind. You're not a footnote in some vast impersonal evolutionary saga. You're the current chapter. Every breath you take is powered by lungs tuned by ice age winds. Every thought you have rides on neural circuits shaped by selection for cooperation and communication in tiny, scattered groups. Every relationship you form exists because your ancestors learned that connection was not a luxury. It was survival. Modern humans did not simply come from Africa or come from everywhere in some easy slogan-like way. We came from crisis. We came from mixture. We came from a long, fragile, improbable chain of connections that somehow never quite broke. And as far as we can tell, that chain includes everyone, all peoples, all continents, all stories, whatever else we are, different, divided, confused, conflicted. We're also this. One species that almost died, then learned how to turn suffering into wisdom, scarcity into innovation, separation into connection. One family, still arguing over the details, still trying to understand how it all began, still telling the story back to ourselves in the dark. And the mystery isn't over. We're still finding new fossils, new DNA sequences, new hints of forgotten cousins and lost migrations. There are probably entire chapters of our past we haven't even guessed at yet. Unknown human species that left traces in our genes but not in our museums. Lost refuges that sheltered our ancestors during storms we don't remember. But even with all that uncertainty, one thing is clear. Whatever we discover next will be about us. All of us. Because in the end, this science doesn't just redraw maps, it redraws identity. It invites you to see yourself not as belonging to one narrow branch, but as belonging to the entire tree, to the bottleneck survivors, to the Neanderthals and Denisovans who shared their world with us, to the countless unnamed people who carried the story forward, one child at a time, and to everyone alive right now, scattered around a planet that is once again entering a time of rapid change. Their resilience is your inheritance, their adaptability is your baseline, their connections are your roots, and the story they began 900,000 years ago is still being written by you tonight. So, where does all of this leave us? We started with a simple question. Did modern humans really evolve in Africa, or is the story more complicated than that? Along the way, we followed tiny bands of survivors through a brutal climate bottleneck, watched them split into Neanderthals, Denisovans, and the ancestors of modern humans, and saw them meet again after hundreds of thousands of years apart. We learned that our story isn't a straight line, it's a web, a mosaic, a long, tangled conversation written in bones and DNA. The old picture said humans evolved in one place, at one time, then marched out to conquer the world. Clean, simple, comforting. But the fossils that don't fit, the ancient DNA hiding in our cells, the traces of unknown ancestors in Asia and maybe even in Europe and Africa, they all whisper the same thing. The truth is messier and far more interesting. Instead of a single cradle of humanity, we see multiple populations spread across Africa, connected and separated, mixing and diverging over hundreds of thousands of years. Instead of a single heroic migration out of Africa, we see waves, earlier excursions that failed, later ones that succeeded, side branches that merged, vanished, or left little genetic ghosts behind. Instead of pure, separate species, we see hybrids, Neanderthal genes in Europeans and Asians, Denisovan genes in Tibetans and Melanesians, and maybe, hidden in our genomes, traces of other humans we haven't even discovered yet. And yet, for all that complexity, one thing is clear. We are still one family. Every person alive today carries the signature of that ancient bottleneck. Every one of us is descended from those scattered bands who refused to give up when the world turned hostile. Whether your ancestors walked the savannas of Africa, the frozen steppe of Ice Age Europe, the high plateaus of Tibet, or the islands of the Pacific, your story flows back into the same deep river. The details differ, the branches twist and rejoin, but the source is shared, and the story isn't finished. Every year, new fossils emerge from caves and deserts. Every year, geneticists sequence ancient bones that rewrite entire chapters of our past. A single tooth from a remote cave can reveal a lost population. A few fragments of DNA can uncover an unknown migration, a forgotten interbreeding event, a new branch on the human family tree. What we've talked about tonight is not the final word, it's just the latest draft. 10 years from now, some of what we think we know will probably be wrong. New discoveries will shift the timelines, redraw the maps, and maybe even introduce entirely new human species we've never heard of. That's not a failure of science. That is science. A constant process of questioning, testing, revising, peeling back the darkness one layer at a time. So as you lie there, drifting towards sleep, you are floating on top of a mystery that's still unfolding. Somewhere, as you listen, a researcher is brushing sand from an ancient skull. Someone is running a new DNA analysis that will challenge everything we've just explored. The past is fixed, but our understanding of it is always changing. If you'd like to keep travelling through that deep time together, you can gently tap like on this video. It helps more curious minds find this story. You can subscribe if you'd like to be here for the next chapter, the next fossil, the next strange clue that doesn't quite fit. And if you feel like sharing, let me know in the comments where you're listening from, which part of this wandering planet you call home as you fall asleep listening to the story of all our homes. There is also an optional YouTube membership for those who want to support the channel a little more directly. It's completely up to you and absolutely not required. Your presence here, your curiosity, your willingness to listen and wonder is already more than enough. Thank you for coming on this long journey into the deep past, for letting your mind walk alongside ancient rivers, through ice age valleys, across deserts and oceans where our ancestors once stood and stared at the same stars you see tonight. The mystery of where we came from is not solved. It may never be fully solved. But that's what makes it beautiful. We are a species born in uncertainty, shaped by catastrophe, refined by cooperation, and driven by questions. As you close your eyes, remember this. You're part of a story nearly 1 million years in the making, and tomorrow, somewhere, someone will discover the next sentence. Sleep well, the mystery continues. The mystery